Welcome back, everyone. For our next session, we've got the team from Asala who have worked on the Carbon and Ties Living Lab, which is a transport sector decarbonisation, as I understand it. And we've got Lindsay Vipon, Senior Consultant, and Chris Fry, their Managing Director. So I'm going to hand over to Chris first, I understand, to introduce, and then we'll be going to Lindsay after that. So, Chris, over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dan. Really good to be with everybody this afternoon as part of another one of these great events to drive the industry forward on decarbonisation. As you say, Dan, we're switching over now to look at infrastructure as opposed to buildings, and specifically transport infrastructure. But lots of the stuff we'll be covering will, I'm sure, be relevant to a whole range of different construction projects right across buildings and infrastructure as well. So we're here really, Lindsay and myself, here on behalf of a team that we've worked with within Accela over the last 2.5 years within the Living Lab, which is part of a much bigger, wider team. We'll come on to that in due course. But some of my colleagues are shown on the right-hand side of this slide. We did manage to get together despite the COVID situation over the last couple of years, and we took inspiration from the Gaia exhibition in Millennium Point in Birmingham for one of those sessions where we were working on some of these solutions and ideas as well. And really, just before I start and before I forget, which I am prone to do later, huge thanks for the collaborations that we've had across the board with the members of the Living Lab, and some of those communities of practice we've worked with, the subject matter experts really within the different client organizations and beyond. So purpose really today is to just give you a flavour. It won't be more than that in the next sort of 10-20 minutes of some of the things we've come up with around carbon and circular economy, in particular around innovations that can be applied, things we've developed, things we've tested, things that the Living Lab has enabled us to develop and test that can now be taken up across the industry, really to unlock those kind of savings that Sam Stacey was talking about earlier, to provide some affordable solutions that drive down cost and value, as well as helping us to accelerate this carbon journey as well. So, and yeah, please do fire away with your questions. We'd be really keen to engage with those as well later on. So the Ties Living Lab. Ties Living Lab is a collaboration of 25 partners. It includes the transport infrastructure clients. So we have Network Rail, National Highways, HS2 Transport for London, and East West Rail. So those core transport infrastructure clients. And then many contractor suppliers, innovative SMEs in analytics and advisory like ourselves, in tech, in manufacturing, and in design, and so on, as well as some universities involved in the program. And as is mentioned on the slide here, we have had some funding for this program as part of that Transforming Construction program with UK Research and Innovation, as well as some funding with some of the other partners, not least Department for Transport. And really, the scope of the Living Lab overall has been around modern methods of construction and using some physical demonstrators of those in the context of infrastructure assets and projects, as well as that data tools and benchmarking. That's the one we're going to be talking about mainly today. And then also some digital demonstrators, some kind of bigger digital solutions as well, which we'll touch on along the way. And so picking up that sort of second strand of the Living Lab, harnessing data, harnessing tools and approaches that kind of enable performance to be improved. And at the heart of that has been benchmarking. 2 points really to make around this slide. The first is that within the Living Lab, we've been able to redefine value and apply that redefinition of value that, again, was referred to earlier in relation to the value toolkit and some of the other government policy documents around that. So we've been dealing with not just looking at performance in what has been perhaps the main focus around cost and schedule, but to actually embrace 9 different performance areas that go from productivity, quality, the 4 environmental ones, which we'll talk about mostly in our session, and social value as well. So that's the first point. The second point is around benchmarking. We'll use the word benchmarking quite a bit in this presentation. It has been long mooted. It isn't a unique idea for the construction sector, far from it. But the simple idea is, if an organization or a project or some part of that project can understand not only what it's doing and achieving, but what that looks like for similar things in the real world, then we can learn from that. How one does that, how the level at which you do it, and what you learn and how you apply that learning is that whole big picture. But around benchmarking, but that's the general concept, and it's kind of a irrefutable concept that if you can get access to that kind of information quickly, it is useful. It is useful intelligence, and of course, the data systems that we now have, the digital tools, do enable benchmarking. So it's not that the construction sector hasn't benchmarked and the infrastructure sector hasn't benchmarked in the past, but I think it hasn't fully grasped the nettle and the opportunity to do that deeper, better, faster now in the digital period. So just setting a little bit more context, although we'll go through this pretty quickly around the sort of the policy context for this. We've heard a number of sort of mentions of these things through the last couple of days. And really the main kind of point here is that there's lots of levels and timeframes and drivers, and we're seeing that decarbonisation thread all the way through a series of policy documents. And really just to say that the Living Lab for ties has come on the back of ties itself, which predated the Living Lab by a few years. So the Living Lab is one of the ways of bringing that strategy, the ties strategy, transport infrastructure efficiency strategy, to life, and that sits alongside the transforming infrastructure performance strategy as well. They go very closely together for the wider infrastructure industry. And again, won't spend really any time on this, but this policy momentum is very much supported by lots of industry and government initiatives for decarbonisation. We're a business champion for Construct Zero. That kind of is the umbrella initiative, but we've also been working recently on the International Cost Management Standard, ICMS. Version 3 now has carbon alongside cost. And then, only yesterday, I think it was, or earlier this week, PAS 2080 is now out as a draft for consultation, which is now bringing in buildings and infrastructure. And that's a common theme, actually. We're dealing with more things now and sharing across the worlds of infrastructure and buildings, which I think is really exciting as well, and really helpful for learning more and faster about this stuff. So really just to then set the scene and hand over then to Lindsay, we within the Living Lab, we've been kind of asking this question of how much are we already using carbon and environmental data? And the basic kind of answer there is we've been collecting a lot of it for many years, but we haven't really been using it to drive performance and asset value. These environmental data points are all sort of there in the ecosystem. They're a bit like insects, probably doing some very important work, around stakeholder engagement, consenting, and other things, and reporting, but probably a bit invisible and a bit unloved compared to the more charismatic species in the ecosystem that are the focus really of when we talk about performance and driving performance as well. So that's been our kind of interest, to try and bring those into the same conversation and the same kind of analysis as well. And there are a number of things that are bringing that to the fore, with the shifts around decarbonisation and the imperatives policy there, but also a move to kind of absolute requirements on things like biodiversity as well. So we're looking to work within carbon budgets. We're looking to deliver biodiversity net gain now, not just do the best we can or do less harm. We are now having to drive these as absolute performance areas, which again makes quite a big difference for the industry going forwards as well. basically, just to sort of hand off to Lindsay, really, our premise has been there is a lot of data around, but we can collect more of it, use it better across these different environmental themes. So over to you, Lindsay, to explore some of the solutions we've come up with and the ideas we've come up with in a bit more detail.
Great, thank you, Chris, and good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here. So yes, as Chris alluded to, in the Living Lab, we've been exploring what can be done today with the data across the 4 themes to uncover innovative new ways of analysing and using the data, as well as setting up for the future. So based on our experience and learnings from the Ties Living Lab, there are 3 things to consider when seeking to benchmark and derive insights. So the first one being understanding the benefits of consistency versus the issue of one size not fitting all. In the case of carbon, for example, in the infrastructure and construction sector, there are various tools out there that can measure carbon. However, due to the range of different types of projects, it's not always consistent. For example, the use of inconsistent taxonomies that can hinder comparability. For material reuse, as another example, if a project or asset has certain types of materials that are readily reusable, then the project would naturally have higher rates of reuse. Fundamentally, projects are different and the environments they are in are different. So benchmarking too superficially in one way at one level may not be robust enough. And so there's an argument for looking at more granular detail. Second, lesson learned is around people and capabilities and that they really matter. In our work in the Living Lab, every one of my colleagues was involved, as we each had different skill sets, different specialisms across our 4 themes, as well as different capabilities in the digital space. And we very much saw this as one of Acceler's key strengths. So interdisciplinary working is essential, but hard, particularly in the real-time, fast-moving environment of a construction project. So take a 4x100 meter relay race, for example. The person passing the data baton needs to give the receiver every chance of using it. So connections and communication are critical to achieving success. Another key lesson learned from our experience in the Living Lab is that working at different scales reveals different kinds of insights. So, for example, top-down benchmarking reveals certain things, and by that I mean set at the higher level of programs and projects. But at the lower bottom-up level of benchmarking, where there is a lot more emphasis on granular detail, this may bring different insights. So both approaches are beneficial for different reasons. This leads me on to introduce 2 of our analytical innovations for granular carbon and circular economy data developed in the Ties Living Lab. So firstly, bottom-up carbon benchmarking. So using a sample of program and project carbon data from 2 Ties partners, we investigated how to bridge between the different taxonomies used for different infrastructure assets. From this, we've been able to dig deeper and benchmark carbon emissions at different levels of granularity. For example, this is just level 1 that you can see on the graph on the left, indicating total emissions by 2 Ties partners for each asset, for example, tunnel, stations, track and bridges. There are 4 asset levels in total, with each representing a higher level of granularity. Also, waste hierarchy analysis. The graph on the right illustrates the aggregation of waste data to give an overall view of where waste is sent. So in this example, we're seeing positive rates of reuse and recycling in operational waste data. Recovery and disposal represent a lower proportion of total waste, which is a positive sign. Due to emissions from processing recycling waste, the waste hierarchy would be in an optimal position when it is top heavy, which means encouraging organisations to reuse more materials. Using this analysis, what we can do here is uncover what's really happening on projects and identify the circularity and cost benefits, helping to push waste up the value chain to recycling and ultimately reuse. This could be useful at portfolio benchmarking, for example, or by region, programme, and so on. Moving on to the next slide, on the power of procurement and supply chain engagement. So it takes 2 to tango. It's not just about the client and the tier 1 suppliers, it's about involving the whole supply chain in the exchange of data, with all parts of it working in unison. We need to consider what we want infrastructure to do for society, capturing the climate and environmental emergencies, and how we value this. I will now go on to outline 2 innovative examples from our work that aligns with this. Firstly, we collaborated with supplier management platform IAND to undertake a mini demonstrator, bringing carbon data into supplier and innovation management. This drew on a different world of data, tapping into published company data, which was largely automated, and bringing that alongside programs and projects. We also considered the innovation activity of contractors and material suppliers. This highlighted to us the different journeys that suppliers are on to achieve net zero, and that we can work with them to bring it to bear on projects. Also, a blueprint for circular procurement, informed by our way of analysing and visualising potential for material reuse. Through the data we collect in the Living Lab, we've been able to identify materials that we would consider having high reuse value. So referring to this graph, in a sentence, this involved identifying where there are opportunities to move from the blue bars of low value recovery of the energy to the orange recycling bars and then to reuse. There are materials that typically can be reused elsewhere to serve a similar purpose. For example, we're seeing a lot of glass and wood that is being recycled rather than reused. So this presents wasted value or a high opportunity cost through this new lens of looking at it. There is more potential to identify these kinds of opportunities, but until you look at it in a more granular way, it can be difficult to determine what these are, which is where our approach here can come in. So moving on to the next slide, no time to waste. So when I was born, I won't tell you when, CO2 levels in the atmosphere were around 357 parts per million. In recent weeks, it has reached 421 parts per million. And at 507 ppm, the planet will have warmed by 1.5 degrees. So the message here is that we really need to get on with this. Even projects nearing end of construction or assets already built, we can improve performance. Gains can be made at every stage of the life cycle. With that, I want to share 2 final examples of very scalable and repeatable innovations from our work in the Living Lab. So in relation to construction planning, ready-to-go circular economy pilot projects, for example, resource exchange mechanisms to facilitate trade of surplus products. A data tracking system is an important element of this. Furthermore, there are lots of low-carbon alternative products and materials coming to market, for example, concrete. Our tool enables forecasting to quantify the carbon benefit of switching to lower carbon materials versus baseline design. This could be useful for optioneering at different design stages, for example, and also open up better understanding of benchmarking of materials. Another lens we can put on this is cost. We weren't able to explore this in much depth in the Living Lab due to data constraints, but the tool is well set up for incorporating both cost and carbon analysis of material choices. I'll now hand back over to Chris to take us through the last couple of slides of the presentation. Thank you.
Great, fantastic. Thanks, Lindsay, for getting into the detail of what we've done there, and really just to zoom back out again. We've got a legacy now from the Living Lab, and across, as with a number of the other transforming construction projects and programs, as it doesn't end there with the work that's being done. There's a wider legacy around these MMC examples, footbridges, signalling equipment room for the line side, and so on. Digital platforms, as I mentioned, and also an adaptable repository that the ONS has been working on, Office of National Statistics, for the benchmarks and data, and the protocols that go around that are all important to enable the data to be useful as well. And also another one is around these communities of practice for collaborative work and benchmarking across the different client organisations. But on this slide, I've just captured some of the things that Lindsay's been talking about, and some others as well. We've come up with maybe 50 little nudge insights or little solutions that can be bolted into existing tools or can be used as a standalone solution as well. So here are the 8 that we've really flagged up as things that we think are most ready to go and can be most valuable to the industry straight away. And really happy to continue this conversation. I think there is a lot of potential to drive this whole life value in our infrastructure and be able to deliver this net zero and decarbonisation at pace alongside those other imperatives, and do that in a sort of data-driven way. So very happy to follow up offline if there's no time to take all of the questions, but perhaps we'll pause there with our presentation, and thank you for listening.
Thanks, Chris and Lindsay. A really interesting set of presentations there in terms of insights that you've gained from the project so far. I had the pleasure of working at Rick's some time ago and remember the work we did on commissioning embodied carbon research by Simon Sturgis, who I know presented yesterday. And it's quite pleasing to see that then grow out into the standards that link, ICMS and embodied carbon. And I think it's at University of Bath that does the data alongside that. Sort of moving on from that and from the learning that you've had there, where do you see the sort of need for additional data to be collected and aggregated at a sort of infrastructure-wide or at least sector-specific examples? Where do you think some of the extra things that need to be measured and captured and shared there in terms of data sets going forward from these projects that you've been working on?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I think if I kick that one off and maybe turn to you, Lindsay, for your thoughts as well, I think that there's a lot more that could be aggregated and shared and used, and that doesn't have to be in any sort of sensitive way. There's all sorts of approaches that can be used to anonymize and benchmark and so on as well. So although, like you say, there's been a lot of progress in capturing whole life carbon, or certain stages of whole life carbon anyway, on a number of projects and assets, there hasn't been very much sharing of it, or the ability to then mine that later or in real time against other projects as well. So I think it's unlocking that aggregation and sharing is a big issue. In terms of other gaps, I think one of the really fascinating things that we started to look at, but it's very much a work in progress, I think, for the whole industry, is looking at the end of life stages and reconsidering end of life and whole life. The end of life stages and how they contribute to whole life carbon and whole life material use and other environmental parameters like climate resilience as well. How do we see that in the world where our assets are going to be manufactured rather than assembled, and maybe can be used and reused in different ways as well in a more circular approach? And I think we're only just beginning to see enough attention on that in terms of gathering the data. Lindsay, did you have any thoughts to add to that?
I just support what you said, Chris. I think in relation to carbon anyway, which is more my area of expertise than the other themes. I mean, I would encourage the collection of whole life carbon data as much as possible and as much detail as possible. I think what we're seeing coming through quite a lot is the measurement of construction data, of course, very important, embodied carbon and materials. But yeah, as Chris said, less so end of life. And whilst that is more difficult to measure, even high level estimates can help to inform how we can reduce those end of life emissions, even if they are due to happen 80, 120 years in the future. So yeah, it's taking that whole life view, which I think is essential for managing carbon across the full life cycle of these projects and these assets.
Yeah, it's encouraging to hear that. One of the questions from the audience, Pete Dennis said, as an industry, we're generally good at capturing loads of data, but are we reluctant to act on it? And at times, do we end up with the sort of arguments around, is it too costly or too difficult to do pile? And what's your experience been from the data that you've gained in the projects you've worked on with different partners in this? Have you got some examples as to how people have acted off the back of the data they've learned through your projects here in the Living Lab?
Yeah, thanks. That's I think it's a journey. I think the journey could be, we could speed this up quite a lot. There is a lot collected, but I think as an industry we're kind of maturing in how the data functions and the digital functions are part of the business and part of the main kind of operating model for the business as well, and that's across the clients and the contractors and the consultants as well. So actually we're seeing that shift, and until we kind of fully make that shift, we won't kind of hold on to the data and value the data in the way that if we had some of the teams from Silicon Valley here, they would have a different sense of what the value of data is versus what the value of the design or the physical asset is as well. And I think we will see ultimately the drive towards digital twins and so on will make this even easier. So we're kind of in an imperfect world of mixed and manual handling of data alongside digital tools, but it's getting better all the time. But I think we've seen within client portfolios, they've been able to look within a region and across regions and so on at and learn lessons pretty fast, and look strategically at some things, as well as looking at them on a project by project basis. So we've seen that on biodiversity and looking at biodiversity assets and the kind of baseline inventory.
Yeah, I was going to ask on that. I was going to ask you, Chris, on that. What I noticed that in one of the I had worked in landscape previous to this role. What's the sort of metrics that you're looking at to measure the biodiversity at a sort of infrastructure scale projects?
Yeah, really exciting time for that with the biodiversity net gain, the Environment Act from last year, and that net gain approach, and the DEF for Natural England biodiversity metric, which is now on to kind of version 3, has catalyzed the whole development industry as well around that in really understanding that, and the ecologists and so on working on that. And the infrastructure sector is coming in line with that and working with that, but also bringing together its own, some new thoughts and challenges, because whereas a individual building or kind of site by site appreciation of biodiversity and net gain, is a little bit different from looking at it on a linear assets and existing very large biodiversity estates and so on, but coming in line with and using the same types of biodiversity metric for different habitat types, and then for watercourses and hedgerows as separate metrics. That's good, because you've then got an alignment that means that you can sort of bring infrastructure alongside development and other things that local authorities and Natural England and so on are valuing as well. So you can kind of then get a strategic approach of where can we all spend the time and the effort and the money to get more from our enhancements.
Yeah, that's great, Chris. And I've got a question from the audience as well for you, Lindsay. Kuno Kansara asks, what are the reasons for the very small difference in total emissions between the baseline and the alternative concrete for the precast as compared to the in situ concrete? So there's a very specific question there for you. I don't know if you can give a bit of insight into that for us, please.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I think I know what graph that is referring to. So it's the tool on low carbon alternatives, and I think that this graph that I showed, it was very much part of a case study of looking at how this tool might work. And to build up its functionality, we firstly had to start looking at emission factors. So for example, at the sort of baseline level, we saw that a lot of emission factors from the ICE database was being used, inventory of carbon and energy from the University of Bath, and so in order to start understanding how low carbon alternatives can impact that and have an additional benefit, we had to collect emission factors for those as well. And gathering emission factors for these lower carbon alternatives was a bit more challenging. The data is not necessarily always in the public domain, and so I think that small difference specifically just comes down to the matter of the emission factors, and the emission factors may not be that much different. There's improvement going to low carbon alternative, but that's just purely based on the emission factor we've chosen in this particular example.
No, thanks for that, Lindsay. I know, the infrastructure sector, I think later this week I've got some meetings in Wales with Welsh agencies who are looking to consider carbon reduction and renewable energy, even in railway stations and transport interchanges and all. And we're starting to see that integrated approach that you've described starting to flow through government agencies and obviously transport providers everywhere. Do you have any final thoughts for the industry, or your top thing you'd like them to do in terms of promoting this agenda going forward before I wrap up then?
Yeah, I think it's embracing benchmarking. It can feel like a little bit of an uncomfortable thing to share a bit of data, even within an organization, let alone beyond and outside that. But it's sort of, if we can unlock that, it will have value, and just put the right caveats around it. We can anonymize it and protect anything that is sensitive, but it can still be useful, even if it's shared on that kind of basis as well. And it will take all of us to sort of do that across different projects and find ways of holding and sharing that data for it to unlock the real value of it.
Thanks. And Lindsay, final word to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I would say one thing I'd like to see, and is increasingly happening, is everyone sort of starting to speak the same language and doing things and measuring carbon consistently across projects. So standards like PAS 2080 is a new version is coming out soon, I think. And if we were to all follow the same standard and carbon measure is measured consistently, that would lead to more robust benchmarking and better comparability and just better understanding generally of the carbon that is being emitted. And I think only that can only help to reduce it.
This has come up on a couple of the sessions already today, is trying to get some simplicity and consistency into the reporting on these metrics is a clear ask from today. So thank you so much. I know you've covered a lot in a short period, and I know you've got so much more in all of your Living Lab projects across the 10 major projects that you've focused on. So, and I know I had a little bit of a look at those before this session. They're really diverse, as you said, for a really wide range of data and infrastructure projects there for your sector. So thanks, Excella, and the work you've done as part of the Living Lab, Lindsay and Chris. And so thanks for your time today, and I'll be back shortly with the next session. So.